0517 local time, somewhere in the North Atlantic. The sea is calm, visibility is clear, and flight operations are already underway. Deep inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the SPY-1 radar picks up 5 new surface contacts appearing along the outer edge of the display. Multiple surface tracks, bearing 041, range 22 nautical miles, speed 24 knots, and increasing. No one in the room reacts openly, but every console in CIC quietly shifts focus. 5 vessels do not appear in a tight formation at high speed by coincidence. The identification system sends out a query. No reply. IFF returns nothing. At 0518, the formation tightens. The 5 ships settle into a shallow wedge, their bows angled toward the projected path of the carrier strike group. Their speed continues to rise. 28 knots. That is not patrol speed. That is a deliberate approach. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier, the officer of the deck receives the update. Course and speed remain unchanged. 25 knots. Steady heading. In a close approach, the first rule is simple. Do not be the first to blink. At 0519, electronic support measures begin detecting emissions. Low-power surface search radar sweeps are coming from at least 2 of the approaching ships. Moments later, a stronger signal appears. Narrow beam, higher gain. Possible targeting quality scan, the electronic warfare officer reports. Still, there is no radio contact. The 5 ships are now inside 20 nautical miles. Ahead of the carrier, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers increase speed and adjust bearing, sliding outward to widen the protective screen. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser shifts to port, extending radar coverage and creating overlapping layers of defense. No siren sound, no dramatic announcement rolls across the ship. But Condition 3 is quietly set. Key stations are manned, defensive systems are brought online, launch cells are powered, but all safeties remain in place. At 0521, the picture begins to sharpen. Hull profiles and emission patterns point toward probable Russian Federation naval vessels. Frigate-class signatures, 1 larger hull, likely a destroyer. Range 15 nautical miles. On the flight deck, 2 F/A-18 Super Hornets are moved into catapult position. Their loadouts are defensive. AIM-120 AMRAAMs and AIM-9X Sidewinders. No strike package, no aggressive configuration, just air superiority. The order comes calmly from primary flight control. Launch. Steam bursts across Catapult 2. The first Hornet is airborne within seconds, banking hard and climbing through 5,000 feet. The second follows less than 30 seconds later. Neither jet activates active radar. Both remain passive, listening, watching, and recording. At 0523, the approaching formation accelerates again. 30 knots, full speed. Their wakes stretch long and white across the dark Atlantic. Then the geometry begins to change. Instead of holding a straight intercept, the outer Russian vessels drift outward, 1 to port, 1 to starboard, widening the approach into a shallow arc. This is not random navigation drift. This is a shaping maneuver. Closest point of approach is recalculated. CPA 2.8 nautical miles and decreasing. At that distance, even a minor steering error could become a serious incident. A deliberate turn could be read as intent. Inside CIC, the Aegis combat system tracks every vessel with exact solution data. Defensive timelines populate the screens in green digital numbers. Nothing is released, nothing is escalated, but every option is ready. At 0525, one of the Russian ships emits a brief signal spike, stronger than before. 3 seconds. Then it disappears. The electronic warfare officer looks up. That was closer. No one needs him to explain. On the bridge, the captain watches the tactical display without raising his voice. Maintain course. Maintain speed. Log everything. The carrier does not alter heading. The message is clear. This transit is lawful, deliberate, and not open to intimidation. Above the formation, the 2 Super Hornets level off at 20,000 feet, circling over the widening arc of steel below. Their sensors zoom in, capturing hull numbers, deck crews, forward mounts, and every visible movement on deck. Infrared confirms elevated heat signatures around forward systems on at least 2 ships. Not actively operated, but not fully neutral either. At 0527, the range drops below 9 nautical miles. The Russian formation now stretches nearly 4 miles across the horizon. The central destroyer holds the most aggressive line, its bow pointed directly toward the carrier's projected path. Wake turbulence grows heavier. Speed remains steady at 30 knots. At 0528, the defensive posture tightens again. Failing CIWS systems move from passive standby into tracking ready mode. The 5-inch guns remain fore and aft, but their alignment shifts slightly, just enough to be seen through long-range optics. Not a threat, a signal. The Aegis system flags new trajectory projections. CPA now reads 1.9 nautical miles. That is no longer ordinary proximity. That is pressure. Still, no radio call comes from the Russian formation, no warning, no explanation, just 5 naval vessels closing at speed, tightening the space around an American aircraft carrier, moving through international waters. At 0529, every screen inside CIC shows converging lines. Every officer understands how thin the margin has become. One sustained tracking signal, one sudden helm correction, one movement read the wrong way. That is all it would take for this quiet North Atlantic morning to change in seconds. The range continues to fall, 6 nautical miles, 5. The formation keeps closing, and nobody blinks. 0531 local time. Range, 5 nautical miles. Then the geometry changes. The 5 Russian vessels no longer hold a simple intercept line. Instead, their formation begins to open. 2 ships ease gradually to port. 2 drift to starboard. The central destroyer keeps pressing directly toward the carrier's bow. It is subtle, it is deliberate, and it is impossible to miss. Inside the Combat Information Center, bearing lines stretch across the tactical display like wires being pulled tight. They're spreading, a surface tracking officer notes. The Aegis system recalculates. Closest point of approach drops again. CPA, 1.4 nautical miles. At this range, there is almost no room for error. A commercial vessel would turn away. A smaller naval ship might reduce speed. The carrier does neither. 25 knots. Steady heading. The strike group responds with quiet precision. The forward destroyer slides half a mile closer to the carrier's projected track, forming a visible screen. The cruiser adjusts 2 degrees to starboard, widening radar coverage and making sure no gaps open between the ships. No sirens, no dramatic announcement, only controlled movement, exact timing, and disciplined corrections. At 0532, the Russian ship on the starboard flank accelerates again. Contact increasing speed, 32 knots, full power. White water breaks hard from its stern as the vessel pushes into the turn, angling diagonally toward the carrier's projected path. This is no longer simple shadowing. This is pressure through movement. Bridge-to-bridge radio opens. Russian naval vessels operating bearing 041. This is a United States warship conducting lawful transit in international waters. Your current maneuvers are unsafe. Recommend you alter course immediately. Silence. The central Russian destroyer holds its line. Through long-range optics, its bow cuts forward at high speed. Deck crews are visible. Personnel stand near forward stations, helmets on, posture alert. Nothing is directly aimed, but nothing looks relaxed either. At 0533, electronic support measures spike again. A narrow beam radar emission sweeps across the carrier's signature. This time, it lasts longer. 5 seconds, then it vanishes. Possible high-grade tracking scan. The electronic warfare officer confirms inside CIC. No one raises their voice, but the Aegis system shifts priority. Defensive options finalize quietly in the background. Long-range response timelines appear ready. Phalanx systems begin tracking each hull automatically. Above the formation, the Super Hornets descend. Altitude now 12,000 feet. Still passive, still silent, but closer. Their sensor pods tighten on bridge windows, mast arrays, radar rotations, deck posture, and hull numbers, recording everything in high resolution. At 0534, the Russian vessel on the port flank mirrors the move from starboard. It increases speed and slides outward, widening the arc. Now the pattern is clear. The carrier is becoming the center point of a forming semicircle. Range, 3 nautical miles. CPA, 1.1. If the starboard Russian vessel holds its current vector, it will pass less than a mile ahead of the carrier's bow. At 25 knots, that leaves only seconds to react. On the bridge, the captain studies the surface plot. His voice stays calm. Maintain course. No hesitation. If the carrier turns first, the story changes. At 0535, the starboard Russian destroyer commits to the maneuver. Its bow angles across the carrier's projected path, holding 32 knots as white water rises hard along its hull. Inside CIC, the bearing lines tighten sharply. CPA now reads 0.9 nautical miles, less than 1 mile. At this distance, the margin for safe navigation is almost gone. A sudden rudder correction from either side could turn a controlled approach into a serious incident. Above the formation, one Super Hornet drops lower, 5,000 feet. It places itself directly between the starboard Russian ship and the carrier's bow line. No aggressive radar use, no sudden move, just presence. A message written in steel, altitude, and jet noise. Below, the carrier does not change heading. The central Russian destroyer remains pointed straight in, keeping pressure on the carrier's path. For 30 long seconds, the geometry tightens even further. Then another radar spike appears, stronger this time. Inside CIC, a warning indicator flickers. Not a confirmed lock, but close enough to matter. Defensive systems remain in controlled standby. Safeties stay engaged. Phalanx mounts rotate by fractions, their tracking arcs following the approaching holes. Nothing is released. No one crosses the line. At 0537, the tension reaches its highest point. 5 Russian naval vessels, 1 American carrier, less than a mile between steel, speed, and intent. The starboard Russian vessel continues its crossing maneuver. The carrier's bow closes the distance quickly, 25 knots, 32 knots. On the displays inside CIC, the combined movement shows more than 50 knots of closing geometry. Every defensive timeline is ready. 1 wrong command, 1 misunderstood radar signal, 1 sudden move, and the situation could change instantly. Then the central Russian destroyer begins to reduce speed. 30 knots, 25, 22. It is slight, but decisive. The starboard ship eases its crossing angle. The vessels on the port flank begin drifting outward by a few degrees. The semicircle starts to open. Radar emissions drop in power. The narrow beam scan disappears completely. Range begins to increase. 1.2 nautical miles, 1.5, then 2. Inside CIC, no one celebrates, but everyone sees it. They're easing off. The carrier never altered course, never slowed, never blinked. At 0539, the 5 Russian ships slide into a parallel shadowing formation. Still close, still visible, still intentional, but no longer closing around the carrier. The geometry has changed. The most dangerous moment has passed. For now. 0541 local time. Range 2 nautical miles and widening. The semicircle has loosened, but the formation has not broken away. The 5 Russian vessels now run nearly parallel to the carrier strike group, offset to starboard and port, holding just outside immediate danger range. Close shadowing, intentional, calculated. Inside the Combat Information Center, no one relaxes. Aegis continues tracking all 5 hulls with defensive solutions active in the background. Response envelopes remain valid. Priority queues refresh every second. The crisis has not ended. It has only changed shape. At 0542, electronic support measures detect a fresh emission. Stronger, more focused, a narrow beam tracking spike. Duration, 6 seconds. Longer than before, long enough to confirm deliberate signal behavior. On the tactical display, a thin warning arc appears briefly over the central Russian destroyer's track. It is not an escalation by itself, but it is a boundary test. The captain's voice remains steady. Confirm source. Central contact, bearing 040. Above the formation, the Super Hornets adjust slightly, holding 8,000 feet while tightening their lateral spacing. They maintain visual dominance without using active radar. Passive sensors continue recording. Bridge windows, mast arrays, radar rotations, deck posture, hull numbers, every detail. At 0543, one of the Russian frigates on the port side makes a subtle course correction. 3 degrees inward. CPA recalculates downward again. 1.3 nautical miles. Not as close as before, but clearly intentional. The geometry tightens once more. On the carrier's forward deck, the 5-inch mount adjusts by a fraction. The movement is mechanical, controlled, and visible through long-range optics. Not pointed directly, but aligned enough to communicate readiness. Phalanx systems remain in tracking posture. Their white domes pivot slightly as each Russian hull crosses through the defensive arcs. Inside CIC, the silence grows heavy. Every operator understands the margin. If the radar spike continues, if the signal pattern shifts further, the response window could shrink to seconds. At 0544, the central Russian destroyer increases speed again. 22 knots, 28. Its wake brightens, spreading white across the cold Atlantic surface. The parallel formation begins drifting closer once more. This is the moment. The pressure point. Relative movement between arcs, headings, and projected tracks again climbs beyond 50 knots. And once again, nobody moves first. The lead Super Hornet drops lower, 4,000 feet now. It crosses directly over the projected line of the central Russian ship, still passive, still silent. Its shadow sweeps across the Russian deck below. Infrared sensors confirm movement among the crew. No systems are elevated, no mounts are trained, but every face is turned upward. At 0545, the radar spike returns. 8 seconds, long enough to register as a sustained tracking sweep. Inside CIC, a soft alert tone pulses. Aegis automatically refines its defensive solution. SM2 response timelines appear in green numbers across the displays. If needed, time to intercept calculations fall below 30 seconds. Vertical launch cells remain powered. Safeties remain engaged. The captain gives no order. He waits. Because the line between pressure and escalation is razor thin. At 0546, the Russian frigate on the port side accelerates, edging closer toward the cruiser screening the carrier. The cruiser answers with a 2-degree outward shift, preserving spacing without giving up position. Neither side turns away. Neither side crosses the final line. For 15 seconds, the Atlantic seems to hold its breath. Radar emissions from the central Russian destroyer remain steady at elevated power. Every operator inside CIC understands the message. This is not an accidental sweep. This is a test of nerve. The Super Hornet wingman slides into a tighter orbit, visible from every Russian deck. 2 American fighters above, 5 Russian hulls below, steel above steel. At 0547, something changes. The radar spike flickers, then weakens, then disappears entirely. The central Russian destroyer begins reducing speed, 28 knots. 23, its bow shifts 1 degree outward, small but measurable. The portside frigate eases off its inward drift. The geometry begins to open. CPA recalculates upward, 1.8 nautical miles, 2.2. The cruiser maintains course. The carrier never deviates. At 0548, the Russian formation stabilizes into a cleaner parallel line, offset to starboard and port, but no longer pressing inward. Radar emissions fall back to low-power surface search. No sustained tracking, no high-grade targeting signals. The flashpoint passes without ignition. Inside CIC, the silence finally breaks. They backed off. No cheers, no celebration, just acknowledgement. Every second of the last 6 minutes has been recorded. Radar signatures, maneuver geometry, emission strength, deck posture, high intelligence value, escalation avoided. At 0549, the range widens beyond 3 nautical miles. The 5 Russian vessels remain in view, running parallel at moderate speed. Close enough to send a message, far enough to avoid collision. The Super Hornets climb again to 12,000 feet, maintaining overwatch. The carrier strike group continues its lawful transit at 25 knots, unchanged. The Atlantic returns to quiet. But everyone inside CIC understands what just happened. For nearly 6 minutes, the distance between shadowing and direct confrontation was measured in seconds, headings, and signal strength. 1 sustained tracking lock, 1 premature response, 1 overcorrection at the helm, and the North Atlantic could have seen something far worse than restraint. Instead, both sides held. Barely. And inside that narrow space between control and escalation, everything changed. 0550 local time. Range, 3.5 nautical miles and opening. The 5 Russian vessels hold their new parallel formation offset wide on both flanks of the carrier strike group. No longer compressing inward, no longer shaping toward encirclement, but still close. Close enough for hull numbers to remain visible through long-range optics. Close enough for the white lines of their wakes to cut sharply across the Atlantic surface. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tempo does not drop. Aegis continues full-spectrum tracking. Every Russian hull remains inside the monitored engagement picture. Defensive solutions stay computed and refreshed. Vertical launch systems remain powered. Phalanx mounts remain aligned. The reduction in pressure is noted, but not yet trusted. At 0551, electronic support measures confirm the change. Russian emissions are returning to a surface search profile. No high-grade tracking signals detected. That is the first measurable sign of de-escalation. The central Russian destroyer, which had held the most direct and aggressive vector, reduces speed again, 23 knots, 19. Its bow shifts 2 degrees farther outward. The geometry opens cleanly. CPA now projects at more than 4 nautical miles. That is no longer a collision envelope, that is shadow distance. On the carrier's bridge, the captain studies the tactical plot in silence. No course correction, no speed change. Maintain transit. The message remains consistent. The carrier does not alter lawful navigation. At 0552, one of the Russian frigates drops farther aft in formation, sliding behind the central destroyer's line. The flanking ships widen their lateral spacing, no longer attempting to bracket the carrier from both sides. The semicircle has dissolved. What remains is a loose parallel escort. Intent still visible. Pressure reduced. Above, the Super Hornets climb back to 15,000 feet, widening their orbit while keeping sensor coverage on the Russian formation. Their presence remains impossible to ignore from the decks below. Infrared pods continue recording. Optical zoom confirms forward stations are unmanned. No hatches open. No mounts are trained. At 0553, bridge-to-bridge radio crackles faintly. A Russian-accented voice comes through, measured and formal. United States Naval Formation. This is Russian Federation Navy vessel conducting routine maritime operations in international waters. It is not an apology. It is not a concession. But it is communication. The reply from the cruiser is just as controlled. Russian naval vessels, United States formation conducting lawful transit. Unsafe maneuvers have been recorded. Recommend continued safe separation. No further exchange follows. No raised tone, no added pressure, just two major naval powers acknowledging each other across open ocean. Inside CIC, analysts mark the timestamp. First Russian radio transmission, 0553. It took 36 minutes from first radar contact to formal communication. That detail will matter later. At 0554, the range expands beyond 5 nautical miles. The Russian formation now matches speed at roughly 18 knots, trailing slightly astern of the carrier's starboard quarter. Still shadowing, no longer pressing. The most dangerous window has closed, but nobody forgets how close it came. At 0555, Condition 3 remains active, though internal readiness begins to normalize. Safeties remain engaged. Defensive timelines are still valid, but they no longer flash as immediate priority alerts. Phalanx mounts return to wider search arcs. Electronic warfare consoles continue passive monitoring. Every emission from the Russian ships is still being catalogued. Frequency patterns, power levels, modulation characteristics. The intelligence value remains high. On the flight deck, additional aircraft are positioned, but not launched. The air wing remains at Ready 5 status, prepared, not provoked. At 0557, the central Russian destroyer changes course slightly northward, 5 degrees away from the carrier's track. The flanking ships follow gradually. It is subtle but decisive. The separation line is re-established, 6 nautical miles. 7. Inside CIC, the geometry finally stabilizes. The senior tactical officer exhales slowly. Not relief, recalibration, no collision, no launch doors opened, no final line crossed. But the space between routine shadowing and direct naval confrontation had narrowed to seconds. The carrier never turned, never slowed, never surrendered navigational control. And that is the point that matters. At 0600, the Russian formation settles into a distant parallel track, no longer converging. The Atlantic looks calm again. Sunlight flashes across steel hulls, moving in separate arcs of intent. Above, the Super Hornets widen their orbit and begin working back toward fuel check thresholds. The strike group resumes a more standard transit posture, though every console remains alert, because encounters like this do not truly end when the ships separate. They continue in analysis rooms, in intelligence briefs, in strategic assessments. For 33 minutes, 5 Russian warships tried to compress the space around a United States aircraft carrier. For 33 minutes, that space held. No retreat, no uncontrolled escalation, only measured movement, discipline, and steel under restraint. The break was not dramatic. It came in pieces. A few degrees of rudder, a few knots of speed, a radar signal reduced. But in naval operations, those small adjustments can mean everything. And as the range stretches toward 8 nautical miles, one fact remains clear. The pressure was tested, the boundary was held, and neither side crossed the final line. 0605, local time. Range, 9 nautical miles. The 5 Russian warships remain on the horizon, their silhouettes smaller now, running a loose shadow pattern off the carrier strike group's starboard quarter. No longer compressing, no longer shaping toward an encirclement, just present. The Atlantic appears calm again, but inside the Combat Information Center, nothing about the last 48 minutes feels routine. Every radar spike, every course correction, every change in speed, all of it is being replayed in real time. At 0606, the Super Hornets begin cycling back toward the carrier. Fuel states are checked. Sensors continue recording. Their mission was deterrence, not engagement. They never activated active radar. They never moved beyond a defensive posture, but their presence changed the geometry. That fact is logged. Inside CIC, the Tactical Action Officer reviews the timeline. 0517, initial radar contact. 0523, high-speed acceleration. 0534, semicircle formation. 0542, sustained high-grade radar sweep. 0547, speed reduction and outward turn. The turning point is clear. The moment the radar sweep held beyond 5 seconds, the entire situation moved closer to the threshold. Had it continued, had it developed further, the decision window would have narrowed to almost nothing. Vertical launch systems were powered. SM-2 response windows had already been calculated. Phalanx systems were aligned and tracking. If the situation crossed the line, the response would not have been dramatic. It would have followed procedure. At 0608, electronic emissions from the Russian formation dropped back to a baseline patrol profile. No focused scans, no elevated power. Their formation begins shifting gradually northward, widening the separation to 12 nautical miles. Shadowing becomes distance. The Atlantic takes back its silence, but something important has changed. On the bridge, the captain steps back from the tactical display. The carrier never changed course, never reduced speed, never surrendered control of its own navigation. That matters. Naval power is not measured only in tonnage, aircraft, or defensive systems. It is measured in who can hold position when pressure closes in. At 0610, flight operations return to full tempo. Another aircraft is launched, routine cycle, steam rises, engines roar. From the outside, it looks as if nothing happened. But inside CIC, the data transfer has already begun. Emission libraries are being updated, frequency signatures are cataloged, radar patterns are preserved at full resolution. In 48 minutes, the Russian ships revealed more than they likely intended, and that is where the real shift happens. This was not only a test of proximity, it was a test of reaction time, a test of restraint, a test of whether a United States aircraft carrier would change course under pressure. It did not. At 0612, the range exceeds 15 nautical miles. The 5 Russian hulls are now distant shapes against the horizon, no longer converging, no longer shaping the geometry, just fading. There will be no immediate press release, no dramatic footage released within the hour. But both navies will write their reports. Both will study the maneuver geometry frame by frame, and both will understand how narrow the margin truly became. For nearly 6 minutes, the situation hovered just below the final threshold. One sustained tracking signal, one misunderstood maneuver, one response made too early, and the North Atlantic could have witnessed something far more serious than wake lines and radio calls. Instead, it witnessed discipline. The carrier strike group continues its transit at 25 knots, unaltered, unmoved, not waiting for permission. The Russian formation turns gradually north and away, increasing separation to 20 nautical miles. The shadow ends at 0615. Condition 3 is relaxed internally. Quietly, defensive systems return to standard readiness. Safeties remain in place. Watch rotations resume their normal rhythm, but no one mistakes what happened. The boundary was tested, the geometry was compressed, the margin narrowed to seconds. And inside that narrow space, something changed. Both sides now have fresh data, fresh understanding, fresh evidence of how the other reacts under pressure. The Atlantic remains calm. But the next encounter will not begin from zero. It will begin with memory. And at sea, memory can be as powerful as steel. Because when 5 warships close in on a carrier and the carrier does not blink, everything changes.